They say every murderer makes one fatal mistake. Tonight, in The Clock That Stopped, we shall discover what that mistake was. I am Arthur Hastings, and this is The Little Grey Cells, where we chronicle the extraordinary cases of my dear friend, Hercule Poirot. First-time listeners, do make yourself known. Subscribe and tell us in the comments which part of the world is listening tonight. And tonight's phrase, my friends, the phrase that will tell Poirot you are one of us, is this: time remembers. So, pour your tisane, find a comfortable chair, and let us engage those little grey cells. The game, as they say, is already afoot and in Porto Bellagio. It began at precisely 3:12. Chapter 1. The Calm That Lies. It was, Hercule Poirot reflected, the sort of afternoon that a man of order and discernment deserved at least twice a year. Porto Bellagio lay before him in the full blaze of the Mediterranean afternoon, its whitewashed houses stacked like sugar cubes along the hillside, each one trailing bougainvillea in shades of cerise and violet. Below, the harbour glittered. Fishing boats knocked companionably against their moorings, their faded paint peeling in the salt air with a cheerful indifference to appearances that Poirot found, privately, quite inexcusable. He himself was immaculate. His pale linen suit had been pressed that morning by the hotel's laundress. A capable woman, though she had used, regrettably, rather too much starch about the collar. His shoes shone. His moustache was, as always, the finest thing in whatever room or street or harbour promenade it happened to grace. Poirot walked with the contained satisfaction of a man who has just consumed a very good luncheon and expects the world to acknowledge the fact. The grilled fish had been exceptional, or the wine, a local white chilled to precisely the correct temperature, had been a small revelation. He had mentioned as much to Mrs. Daphne Langley, an English widow of comfortable means and comfortable opinions, who had the adjacent table at the Café del Porto, and who had been kind enough to listen. "I have trained myself," he had told her, dabbing his lips with the linen napkin, "to insist upon the egg at the precise temperature. Not too hot, you understand, and emphatically not too cold. The English, if you will forgive me, madame, are cavalier about such matters." Mrs. Langley had smiled in the way of English women who are perfectly accustomed to being told they are cavalier about things, and consider it, on the whole, rather a compliment. She was a handsome woman of 50 or thereabouts, grey-haired, well-dressed, with the composed eyes of someone who had weathered some private sadness and emerged from it intact, if somewhat altered. She had been in Porto Bellagio a fortnight, she said, for the air. Poirot was in Porto Bellagio for no reason at all, which was itself a reason of the finest kind. Now he walked along the promenade in the golden hour before the tourist boats began their retreat to the larger ports, and he was content. The town spread around him with an air of pleasant openness. Streets fanning out into bright squares where children chased cats over sunlit cobblestones, and terraces from which old men surveyed the world with the unhurried authority of those who have nowhere in particular to be. Yet there was something about Porto Bellagio that nagged faintly at the edges of his appreciation. The geography, for one thing. Cliffs to the north, sea to the south, a single winding road that climbed through lemon groves before disappearing over the ridge. The town was charming. It was also, in a quiet, architectural fashion, a trap. Sound carried strangely here. Footsteps rang in the narrow alleys with an intimacy that suggested surveillance. Conversations drifted down from upper balconies. A shutter, slammed by the afternoon wind, cracked like a pistol shot across the square, and two cats shot under a cart with offended dignity. Poirot paused before the window of a small shop on the Via Orologio. The sign above the door read, in faded gilt lettering, Bellini, Orologi e Riparazioni, Clocks and Repairs. To the window display was an eccentric paradise, mantel clocks in marble and ormolu, a long case clock leaning slightly to the left, as though confiding a secret to the wall, carriage clocks in brass and tortoiseshell. They ticked and chimed with cheerful independence, each keeping its own counsel as to the correct hour. Poirot withdrew his pocket watch. 3:12. He glanced at the café clock visible above a striped awning further along the promenade. Also 3:12. He smiled. There was, and in the agreement of two timepieces, a small but genuine satisfaction. Symmetry, he murmured to no one in particular. It is the foundation of civilization. He was still admiring the window display when he became aware that he was being observed. Inside the shop, just beyond the glass, stood a man of middle age with a face that gave nothing away. Dark eyes beneath heavy brows. The expression of a man watching something he has watched before and does not wish to see again. This, presumably, was Marco Bellini, the proprietor, to judge by the possessive pride with which he occupied his domain. When Poirot met his eyes, Bellini did not smile. He stepped back, and the shadows of the interior absorbed him. Curious. Poirot moved on, his cane tapping the warm stones. Further along, at the best-situated table outside the Café Impérial, a man in the uniform of retired authority sat with a newspaper. He was perhaps 60, trim, with the upright posture of a former naval officer and the tanned skin of a man who had spent his years on or near the sea. Captain Henri Vasson, Poirot had learned in the idle way one learns such things in a small town. From a waiter, from a nod of introduction, from the way a man takes his aperitif. Vasson had been in Porto Bellagio 3 weeks. He sat very still, the newspaper open before him. He had not turned a page in 20 minutes. A child appeared at Poirot's elbow, a girl of perhaps 10, dark-haired, barefoot, selling small bunches of flowers with the business-like air of one conducting serious commerce. She thrust a carnation towards him. Per il signore. Poirot bought it more from instinct than from want of a carnation, and turned to compliment her. But the child had already vanished into the narrow opening between a baker's shop and a crumbling wall. He looked after her with a small frown. He had noticed her before, he realized. Twice, perhaps 3 times, at intervals that suggested deliberate proximity. He was still considering this when the woman stepped from the doorway of Bellini's shop. She had not been there a moment ago. That was Poirot's first, entirely certain observation. His second was that she was frightened, not in the obvious fashion. No trembling hands, no wild eyes. The fear was controlled, contained, high like a fire with its damper shut, visible only in the extraordinary stillness of her face and the careful way she held herself, as though movement might betray her. Elena Marceau was perhaps 35 and had been very handsome. She was still striking, but with the particular quality of someone who has not slept properly in some time. Her dark eyes were shadowed. Her elegance, and it was real elegance, Poirot noted. What the kind that belongs to the woman herself rather than to her dressmaker was somewhat strained at the edges, like fine fabric pulled too tight. She gripped his sleeve. "Monsieur Poirot." Her voice was barely above a whisper. The clock must not stop again. Poirot went very still. She seemed startled by her own words. A kind of shudder moved through her, quickly suppressed. She looked once over her shoulder, then back at him with an expression that combined urgency with something he could only describe as resignation. "It is already too late," she whispered. And then she was gone, folded into the stream of afternoon pedestrians with the practiced ease of someone who has spent time not being found. Poirot stood on the pavement for a long moment. He turned very slowly toward the shop window. Among the clocks in the display, the chiming, the ticking, the self-important congregation of timepieces. One stood apart. A brass carriage clock, small and handsome, positioned at the centre of the display, as though it had always occupied that precise spot. Its hands pointed to 3:12. They did not move. Above him, on a balcony overlooking the promenade, two figures stood in low, urgent conference. One of them was Elena Marceau. The other was a man Poirot had not yet met. Well-dressed, precise, with the air of a professional person conducting matters of importance. As Poirot watched, the man placed a hand on Elena's arm in a gesture that might have been comfort or might have been constraint. It was, the little grey cells suggested, the sort of gesture that requires careful examination before one decides which. A waiter emerged from the cafe beside him and promptly dropped an entire tray of glasses. The crash brought heads turning. In the confusion, Poirot glanced at the waiter, a young man, pale beneath his tan, who was staring at Poirot with an expression of naked and inexplicable alarm. Not the alarm of a man who has dropped a tray. Something older and more specific than that. "Spiacente, spiacente," the waiter said rapidly, and bent to gather the wreckage without further meeting Poirot's eyes. Poirot walked on. He walked slowly, observing. The town still gleamed in the late afternoon light. Children laughed, when the fishing boats knocked at their moorings. The tourist boats were beginning at last to collect their passengers and put out to sea, and Porto Bellagio was settling into the quieter, more considered version of itself that it became each evening when the visitors departed. It was very beautiful. It was also, Poirot thought, distinctly uneasy. Like a face composing itself before a mirror, careful and deliberate, hiding something behind the pleasantness of its expression. That night, long after he had retired to his room, long after the harbour had fallen silent and the church clock had struck 11 and then 12, he lay awake and stared at the ceiling and listened to the town breathing in the dark. The clock must not stop again. He could not account for the certainty that had settled over him like a cold hand, that the woman had known his name. Not recognized it, not encountered it by chance, known it, had come to find him, or had found him, or had said what she said because he, specifically, was standing there. And the clock in the window, frozen at 3:12, its hands perfectly still among all those moving ones, watching the promenade with the patience of something that had already decided to wait. Hercule Poirot, who trusted his little grey cells above all other instruments, found that they were not, tonight, entirely silent. They were telling him that the afternoon, for all its beauty, had been the calm before something, and that the something had already begun. Chapter 2. The cage revealed. The telegraph office was closed, not merely shut for the afternoon in the Italian fashion, which Poirot had come to regard as a sensible arrangement, but closed in the more absolute sense. A handwritten notice pinned to the door, a padlock on the shutter, and a boy outside who said, with the cheerful finality of one delivering unimportant news, that the line had come down in the night. A rockfall on the northern road, or someone added. The repair would take 2 days, perhaps 3. One shrugged. Poirot stood before the padlocked door for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then he looked out to sea. The sky to the south had changed overnight. What had been a clean Mediterranean blue was now complicated by a long shelf of pewter cloud sitting on the horizon with a settled, purposeful air. The fishermen, he had already noticed, were not going out. They stood in small groups by the harbour wall, talking in lowered voices and looking at the weather with the critical attention of men whose livelihoods depend on reading it correctly. No telegraph, road north impassable, storm coming from the south. Porto Bellagio was, for the moment, entirely itself. No more and no less. Poirot bought a small coffee at the nearest bar, stood at the counter in the Italian manner, and considered the altered quality of the town around him. It was subtle, the change. The same streets, the same light, or the same bougainvillea spilling its colour over the same crumbling walls. Yet something had shifted. Doors that yesterday stood open were half closed. The broad, welcoming piazza felt, this morning, less like an invitation than an enclosure. Movement had narrowed. People walked with more deliberation, as though they, too, had noticed that the exits were temporarily unavailable. He set down his cup and went to call upon Marco Bellini. The bell above the shop door announced him with a thin, crystalline note that seemed disproportionately loud. Inside, the smell of the place reached him at once. Oil, metal, old wood, and something else beneath those, something careful, like a room in which things are kept that are not for display. Bellini appeared from a back room, wiping his hands on a cloth. By daylight he was a compact man of 50 with the broad, capable hands of someone who works in small, precise ways. His face was the face of the window, neutral, contained, or offering nothing. He looked at Poirot with the expression of a man who expected this visit and had decided in advance how to conduct it. Monsieur Poirot, a slight inclination of the head. You wish, perhaps, to have something repaired. I wish, said Poirot pleasantly, to look at a clock. He gestured toward the window. Bellini's eyes moved to the brass carriage clock at the centre of the display. Something passed across his face, quickly, carefully suppressed. A customer brought it in for repair, Bellini said. He has not returned. When was this? A week ago, perhaps 10 days. He set the cloth down on the counter with the deliberateness of a man who does not want his hands observed. I have not yet had occasion to examine it closely. Poirot looked at him with mild, polite interest. You will permit me. He did not wait for an answer. He crossed to the window, lifted the carriage clock with both hands, noting its weight, its balance, in the quality of its case, and set it on the counter. Then he opened the back panel with the ease of a man who has handled such things before. The mechanism inside was pristine, the mainspring fully wound, the escapement perfectly aligned. There was no fault, no worn part, no reason whatsoever for the hands to have stopped. Voilà, said Poirot quietly. It has not stopped from neglect. It has not stopped from damage. It has been stopped deliberately. He closed the panel and looked at Bellini. Bellini had gone the colour of the whitewashed wall behind him. I cannot account for— Non, non. Poirot raised one finger gently. You will not, I think, find it useful to account for anything just yet. I ask only this. The man who brought the clock. Describe him to me. The description that followed was precise in its details, and useful in none of them. Middle height, middle age, dark coat are no distinguishing features. The face of a man designed not to be remembered. Bellini delivered it with the fluency of something rehearsed, and Poirot listened with the patience of someone who knows that what is not said is often more instructive than what is. He thanked Bellini with great courtesy, replaced the clock in the window with his own hands. The stopped face looking out at the promenade at 3:12, and departed. Captain Vasson was waiting for him outside. This, Poirot suspected, was not a coincidence. Vasson had positioned himself against the wall opposite with the studied casualness of a man who has spent time on bridges and knows how to stand without appearing to watch. He straightened as Poirot emerged and fell into step beside him, with a friendliness that had a faintly urgent quality, like a door pushed open a little more firmly than the occasion required. A fine morning, Vasson said, despite the weather. You are interested in clocks, mon capitaine? Vasson glanced at him sideways. I am interested in Mademoiselle Marceau. You spoke with her yesterday. She spoke to me, Poirot said. There is a distinction. She is not a reliable woman. Vasson chose the word carefully, then appeared to reconsider it. She is unwell. Nerves. She has been unwell for some time. Whatever she may have said to you, I should not wish you to form an inaccurate impression. How kind of you, said Poirot, to concern yourself with the accuracy of my impressions. Vasson stopped walking. They had reached the harbour wall, and below them the dark water heaved with the first suggestions of the coming storm. He looked at Poirot with an expression that had abandoned the pretence of friendliness and was considering what to replace it with. She imagines things, he said finally, connections that are not there, patterns, significances. He paused. It would be a kindness to her and to everyone, or if her anxieties were not encouraged. Poirot regarded him for a long moment. The egg-shaped head tilted very slightly. Tell me, he said, at precisely what time did you last see Mademoiselle Marceau yesterday evening? Vasson blinked. At dinner, 7 o'clock, perhaps past. You are certain? Perfectly certain. Bon. Poirot smiled with great warmth and no information. I thank you, mon capitaine. The air here is most invigorating. You will excuse me. He found Mrs. Langley on the terrace of the hotel, apparently absorbed in a letter she was writing, but actually, he judged, watching the road that led up from the harbour. She set down her pen as he approached and offered him the chair opposite with the instinctive hospitality of a well-bred woman who has spent a great deal of time sitting in places alone. Elena Marceau, she told him, had arrived in Porto Bellagio a fortnight ago. No, she did not know from where. She had seemed initially like any of the quiet, solitary travellers one encountered in such places. A woman taking some air, perhaps recovering from something. But in the last week she had become noticeably more agitated, watchful. She had asked Mrs. Langley once, in a tone that attempted lightness and did not quite achieve it, whether any strangers had arrived in town recently. "What sort of strangers?" Poirot asked. "That was precisely what I asked her." Mrs. So Langley folded her letter with a neat precision that suggested she had no intention of finishing it. She said, "The sort who do not announce themselves." And then she laughed, as though it were a perfectly ordinary thing to say. Dr. Kessler, who had been taking coffee at the far end of the terrace with the air of a man minding his own affairs, rose at this point, crossed to their table and sat down without being invited. He was a composed man of perhaps 50, yet with the cultivated manner and measured speech of someone accustomed to being listened to. His eyes were a very pale grey, and they moved between Poirot and Mrs. Langley, with the unhurried attention of a man who makes assessments professionally. "I could not help overhearing," he said with a smile that acknowledged he had positioned himself to do exactly that. "You are asking about Eleanor. I am her physician, in an informal capacity. She has been under considerable strain. I have advised rest, quiet, and the avoidance of stimulation." He glanced at Poirot with a courtesy that contained a warning in it. "She is given to associations, fearful ones. Her mind constructs narratives from coincidence. It is a recognized condition." "Most interesting," said Poirot. "And the clock in Bellini's window, is that also a coincidence which her mind has constructed into a narrative?" A pause, brief but measurable. "I cannot speak to clocks," Kessler said. He finished his coffee and excused himself with the same composed courtesy with which he had arrived, and departed down the terrace steps without hurry. Poirot looked after him. Then he looked at Mrs. Langley, who was looking at her unfinished letter with an expression he could not immediately read. "Madame," he said gently, "you have been coming to Porto Bellagio for some years, I think?" 12 years, she said, "since my husband died." "And before that?" She looked up. Her eyes, he noticed now, they were not merely composed. They were the eyes of a woman who has disciplined herself over a long time not to look at certain things. "Before that," she said carefully, "was a different life altogether." Poirot said nothing. He had found, over the course of a career conducted largely in drawing rooms and dining cars, that silence was frequently the most productive question one could ask. He returned to his room as the first drops of rain began to fall, and on the floor outside Elena Marceau's door, placed with a neatness that was itself a kind of statement, sat a small brass clock. Its face was stopped. The hands read 3:12. Poirot knocked. Once, twice, a third time. No answer came from within, only the wind off the harbour, finding its way through some gap in the old building's fabric, and moving along the corridor like something looking for a room. Chapter 3. The game announces itself. The maid who found her was called Rosaria, and she had the misfortune to be both sensitive and thorough. She had knocked at 7:30 as instructed with the morning coffee. When there was no answer, she had tried the handle, locked, and gone for the manager, who had tried the handle, confirmed the lock, gone for the spare key, used it, and then stepped back into the corridor and stood there in the attitude of a man who wishes very much that he had remained in bed. Poirot was summoned at 8:10. He dressed with his customary care, which was not vanity in such a moment, but rather the opposite, a refusal to let the disordered world dictate the terms of one's appearance. He descended the stairs, traversed the corridor with his cane tapping its quiet rhythm, and stood in the doorway of Elena Marceau's room for a long moment before entering. She lay on the narrow hotel bed with a stillness that was absolute. Her hands were folded at her waist, not by accident, not by the chance arrangement of sleep. Folded. Her dark hair was spread carefully on the pillow. Her expression was one of composed resignation, as though whatever she had been waiting for had arrived at last, and proved to be neither better nor worse than expected. Her wristwatch had been removed from her wrist. It lay beside her on the coverlet, face upward. The hands stood at 3:12. Poirot moved through the room with deliberate economy, touching nothing, noting everything, and the window stood open to the sea. The curtains moved in the salt air with a slow, rhythmic patience that was in terrible contrast to the stillness of the woman on the bed. No glass disturbed, no chair overturned. The room had the theatrical tidiness of a scene arranged for an audience, and the arrangement was very precise indeed. On the nightstand, beside a glass of water that had not been drunk, lay a small enamelled disc, no larger than a pocket watch. Its face was white, its hands black. You painted on. No numbers. Frozen, like everything else in the room, at 3:12. Poirot picked it up with his handkerchief and turned it over. On the reverse, engraved in a neat, unhurried hand. Time remembers. He stood very still. The phrase reached somewhere old in his memory and pressed against it. Belgium, a railway platform. A winter afternoon more than 20 years past, and a case that had never reached its resolution. A disappearance, a family destroyed by grief, and a watch that had stopped, and a detective who had returned to his rooms in Brussels with the particular hollow feeling of a man who knows he has missed something but cannot yet see what. The watch, then, had stopped at 3:12. He had never, in the many years since, entirely ceased to think about it. His hands, he noticed, were not entirely steady. He put the disc in his breast pocket, straightened his cuffs, and was Hercule Poirot again by the time the manager reappeared in the doorway with a great deal of anxious Italian and very little information. The doctor was sent for. It was, inevitably, Dr. Kessler who came. Composed, unhurried, carrying his bag with professional authority. He examined Elena without speaking, made several observations in a small leather notebook, and pronounced, after a silence that Poirot found instructive in its length, that she appeared to have died of cardiac failure. She was a young woman, Poirot observed. She was not a well woman. Kessler closed his bag with a click. I warned her. Rest, I said. Quiet. He did not look at Poirot as he said this, which was itself a form of looking very hard indeed. No doubt, said Poirot pleasantly. I wonder, the glass of water on the nightstand, has it been touched? By whom? By anyone, including yourself, mon cher docteur. A pause of precisely the right length to be noticeable. I touched nothing, Kessler said. Poirot thanked him and went in search of Captain Vasson. He found him in the hotel dining room, standing at the window that overlooked the harbour, with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand, and an expression that had moved some considerable distance from the studied neutrality of the previous day. He turned when Poirot entered, and the question he had been preparing to ask died on his face when he saw Poirot's own. She is dead, he said. It was not a question. She is dead, Poirot confirmed. He sat down at the nearest table and indicated the chair opposite, with a gesture that, while perfectly polite, contained a certain element of instruction. Vasson sat. "Tell me about Belgium," said Poirot. The silence that followed was of a different quality from Kessler's calculated pause. This one had the quality of a wall, solid, long-maintained, and suddenly aware that something on the other side of it was applying pressure. I don't know what you mean," Vasson said. "Then I shall be more precise." Poirot folded his hands on the table. "In Belgium, 20 years ago, a child disappeared. A girl of 9 years. She vanished from a railway train on a winter afternoon. The 312 from Liège. The case was investigated. It was not solved. Several persons who were known to have been on that train subsequently dispersed to various corners of Europe and did not, to the best of my knowledge, seek one another's company." He looked at Vasson steadily. "And yet here in this small, temporarily enclosed town, I find Mademoiselle Marceau, who was, I believe, employed then as a railway clerk at Liège. I find a clockmaker who was, at the same period, a watchmaker's apprentice in that city. I find a physician whose professional career begins in Brussels in the months immediately following the disappearance. And I find yourself, then a younger officer with the Belgian merchant fleet. I frequently in port at Liège." Vasson had set down the coffee cup. His hands flat on the table were very still. "And you find," Poirot added almost gently, "Hercule Poirot, who investigated that case and has not forgotten it. You cannot prove—" "I am not in a courtroom, mon ami. I am in a hotel dining room, and a woman is dead, and I am asking you a question." Poirot's voice had not risen. It had, if anything, become quieter, and it was somehow worse for that. What hour did you last see Elena Marceau alive?" This time the silence lasted considerably longer. 8 o'clock, Vasson said finally. "Last evening, she came to my room." "That is not what you told me yesterday." "Yesterday, I did not know she was going to be dead this morning." He looked up, and Poirot saw in his face something unpleasant. Not grief exactly, but the close cousin of it. The feeling of a man who has made calculated decisions and is beginning to measure their cost. "She came to tell me she had spoken to you. She was frightened, more frightened than I had seen her." "Of what, precisely, was she frightened?" "Of him." Vasson said it with the simplicity of a man who has only one answer to that question, and then stopped, as though he had said more than he intended. "Him," Poirot repeated. He waited, but Vasson had remembered himself. The wall went back up, brick by brick, behind his eyes. It was then that Poirot received the note. The hotel boy delivered it on a small brass tray, with the solemn bearing of one entrusted with something important. It was addressed to Captain Vasson in a hand Poirot did not recognize. Vasson opened it, read it, and the remaining colour left his face with the speed and completeness of a tide going out. He handed it to Poirot without speaking. The note read, "When the clock stops twice more, the past will be complete. No salutation, no signature." The paper itself was of good quality, the kind available at any hotel writing desk, and the hand was neat, educated, and entirely without personality, as though the writer had taken some trouble to ensure it revealed nothing. Poirot folded it into his breast pocket alongside the enamelled disc. He transformed the hotel sitting room into a working space that afternoon, with the quiet efficiency of a general establishing a command post. The manager provided maps. The hotel ledger was, and with some persuasion, made available. A timeline was constructed on the back of a menu card. Arrivals, departures, observed movements, noted discrepancies. He interviewed the waiter who had dropped the tray. The boy, whose name was Stefano, proved under patient questioning to have seen a figure leaving Elena Marceau's corridor at approximately 11 o'clock the previous evening. He had not seen the face. He had seen the shoes. Good shoes. Expensive. The shoes of a professional man. Poirot wrote this down. He then sent word to every household in Porto Bellagio, through the manager, through the boy, through the woman who operated the small post office, that no one was to leave the town, and that all clocks and watches were to remain unwound until further notice. This last instruction caused considerable confusion and some offence. Poirot did not apologize for it. He sat alone in the sitting room as the storm outside reached the harbour in earnest, rain hammering the shutters, the sea loud and grey beyond the windows, and he held the enamelled disc in his palm and looked at it. Time remembers. 20 years was a long time to wait for a reckoning, but someone, it was now quite clear, had been waiting very patiently indeed. And they had built this, all of this, the clocks, the town, the isolation, the theatrical arrangements of the dead, with Hercule Poirot somewhere in mind. That was the thought he could not put away. Not the murder, not the note, not even the dead woman arranged like a figure in a painting. The thought that this game had been constructed with a specific opponent in view, and that the opponent was himself. Chapter 4. The clock begins to run. The storm broke fully in the night and was gone by morning, leaving Porto Bellagio washed and glittering and smelling of brine and wet stone. The sea was still restless, long grey swells moving under a pale sky. But the clouds had thinned, and the light that came through Poirot's window had the peculiar clarity that follows violence, as though the air itself had been scoured clean. Poirot had not slept. He had sat instead at the writing desk with his timeline, his notes, and the enamelled disc, rearranging the pieces with the methodical patience of a man who knows that the answer exists, that it must exist, because facts do not vanish, they only wait for the correct arrangement, and who is prepared to work until he finds it. Then by 4 in the morning he had the framework. By 6 he had the connection. By the time he descended for breakfast, moving through the washed morning with the contained energy of a man who has made progress, he knew the shape of the thing, if not yet its face. Elena Marceau, Captain Henri Vasson, Dr. Adrian Kessler, Marco Bellini. All 4 had been in Belgium 20 years ago. All 4 had connections, however dispersed and circumstantial, out of the city of Liège and to a winter afternoon on which a child of 9 had stepped onto a train and ceased to exist. Not died, there was a distinction, and Poirot had always felt it, but ceased to exist in the ordinary, recoverable sense. No body, no ransom, no word. Simply gone, as thoroughly as if the train itself had swallowed her. The family, a Belgian father, a French mother. The mother English by origin, a Mrs. He pressed his memory, which was excellent, Langley, as she had reverted to her English name after the marriage ended. He recalled the file now with the sharpness of something long preserved. The mother's grief, which had been of the controlled, devastating English variety. The father's, which had been louder and had broken him sooner. He set down his coffee cup with great precision. Mrs. Daphne Langley, who came to Porto Bellagio every year for 12 years, who watched the road from the harbour, who had said, with eyes carefully averted from whatever they did not wish to examine. Before that was a different life altogether. He was so absorbed in the implication of this that he almost failed to notice Lucia. She was crouched in the far corner of the breakfast terrace behind a large terracotta pot of geraniums, watching him with the alert, measuring attention of an animal that has learned caution from experience. She could not have been more than 10 or 11. Her feet were bare despite the wet stones. She had, he noticed, been there for some time, because the geranium leaves nearest to her had been absently stripped of their lower petals, in the distracted way of a child who is thinking hard about something else. Poirot buttered a corner of his roll with care. He did not look directly at her. He had found with children of a certain wariness that the direct approach was fatal. They vanished like smoke the moment they felt themselves observed. Instead, he addressed the middle distance with a remark of no apparent consequence. "The geraniums," he said conversationally, "are a very fine variety. The red ones particularly have an excellent character." A pause. "They are ordinary geraniums," said a small voice from behind the pot. "Ah," said Poirot. "But ordinary is not the same as uninteresting. I myself am sometimes described as ordinary." He allowed a moment. "By people who do not know me well." The silence that followed was of the considering kind. Then Lucia came around the pot and stood before him in the manner of someone who has decided to conduct an interview and wishes it understood that she is conducting it, not the other way around. She studied him with dark, serious eyes that were older than the rest of her face. She held out a folded square of paper. Poirot took it, unfolded it, and read it. 5 names. Written in a hand he did not recognize, careful, schooled, the hand of someone who had been taught to write properly and had not forgotten. 4 of the names he knew: Elena Marceau, Captain H. Vasson, Dr. A. Kessler, Monsieur Bellini. The 5th was his own: Hercule Poirot. Elena Marceau's name had been crossed through with a single, neat line. His own name was circled. He folded the paper again and placed it in his pocket alongside the enamelled disc. Then he looked at Lucia. "Where did you get this?" "A man gave it to me." She said it without inflection, as a fact. "What man?" "I don't know him. I had not seen him before." She considered. "He had good shoes." Poirot thought of Stefano and the shoes of a professional man on the corridor outside Elena's room. He kept his face entirely agreeable. "When was this?" "Yesterday, before the rain." She watched him steadily. "He said to give it to you after she was dead." The breakfast terrace was very quiet, and below it the harbour moved in its slow morning rhythm. Somewhere in the old town a bell struck the hour. "He knew she would be dead," Poirot said. It was not addressed to Lucia. She answered it nonetheless. "Yes." "And you? You knew also that she was going to die?" Something moved in the child's face. Not grief in the adult sense, something rawer and less formed. The expression of someone who has encountered the worst possibilities of the world sooner than they should have. "I knew she was frightened," Lucia said. "I watch people. When they are frightened like that, sometimes the thing they are frightened of comes." Poirot regarded her for a long moment. "You are a very observant young person," he said gravely. "Tell me, Have you lived here all your life? The question was simple enough. Its answer was not. Something happened behind Lucia's eyes, a shutting, a careful closing off, like shutters drawn against weather. She took a step back and shook her head, not in answer to the question, but as a refusal of it. And then she turned and walked quickly across the terrace and down the harbour steps, and was gone among the fishing boats before Poirot could speak again. He looked after her for a long time. Then he went to find Mrs. Langley. She was in the hotel garden, ostensibly reading, actually sitting very still with a closed book in her lap, and the expression of a woman engaged in an internal argument of long standing. Now she looked up when she heard his footstep on the garden path, and something in her face readied itself, composing, adjusting, preparing the agreeable surface she customarily presented to the world. Poirot sat down without preamble and said, "Madame, I believe Elena Marceau spoke to you privately before she died." A pause. The book shifted in her lap. "She told me," Mrs. Langley said at last, with the care of someone carrying something fragile, "that if she died before the 3rd clock stopped, I was to warn you." She looked at him with eyes that were making an effort of courage. "She said you would know what it meant. She said you were the only person who might." "Did she say anything else?" "She said—" Mrs. Langley stopped. She looked down at the closed book and then back up, and her composure had developed a fracture in it, fine as a hairline crack, but visible. She said that the people in this town were not strangers to one another, that they shared a secret, that the secret was— She pressed her lips together, that it involved a child. The garden held them both in silence. Poirot looked at Mrs. Langley's hands, folded over the book, the composed face, the disciplined eyes. 12 years of annual pilgrimages to the same small town on the same stretch of coast. A different life altogether. He said, very gently, "Madame, your daughter, the child who was lost in Belgium, how old would she be now?" The crack in Mrs. Langley's composure widened. She did not speak. She did not need to. The answer was in the way she turned her head, sharply, involuntarily, toward the harbour steps where a barefoot child had gone down among the fishing boats and out of sight. Poirot was already on his feet. He moved with an urgency he did not show in his face, back through the hotel, into the street, down the steps toward the water, his cane striking the wet cobblestones in a brisk, purposeful rhythm. The little grey cells, which had been assembling their evidence with patient diligence for 3 days, had just reached a conclusion, and the conclusion changed everything. Chapter 5. The Pursuit and the Maze. He did not find her at the harbour. The fishing boats rocked at their moorings in the pale morning light, and the men who worked among them looked at Poirot with the polite, incurious attention of people who have spent their lives watching strangers pass through and have long since ceased to find them remarkable. One of them, an old man mending a net with the unhurried competence of long practice, indicated with a lift of his chin that a child had gone up the Via Pescatori, the narrow street that climbed from the waterfront into the older quarter of town. Poirot climbed it. He was not, by his own frequent admission, a man designed for physical urgency. He found it, in the general way, inelegant. The stairs of Porto Bellagio's upper quarter were steep and uneven, and not improved by the previous night's rain. His shoes registered their objection at each step. He climbed nonetheless, his cane finding purchase on the wet stone, and at the top stood breathing carefully in the manner of a man who will not permit himself to pant, surveying a small, irregular square from which 3 alleys diverged in 3 different directions. Lucia sat on a wall at the far edge of the square, eating an orange. She watched his ascent with the composure of someone who has deliberately waited and wishes it known. Poirot crossed the square, seated himself on the wall beside her without invitation, and for a moment said nothing at all. He looked out over the rooftops to the sea, which glittered now under a sky that had recovered its Mediterranean confidence. Below, the town went about its morning. "You waited," he observed. "You were coming anyway," she said. She separated another segment of orange with her thumbnail. "You had another question." "Several." He turned to look at her. The serious dark eyes, the barefoot self-containment, the sense of a person who has constructed careful arrangements for surviving the world on her own terms. "But I find, now that I am here, that perhaps I will not ask them." She glanced at him sideways. "Why?" "Because," Poirot said, "the questions I was going to ask were about who you are, and I find that I am no longer certain it is my right to ask them. That is a matter for someone else." He paused. "Someone who is, at this moment, sitting in a hotel garden holding a closed book very tightly." The orange segment remained in Lucia's hand, uneaten. "She is here," the child said. It was not a question, and it was not addressed to Poirot. It was the particular tone of a thought spoken aloud by someone who has received a blow they had, on some level, been bracing for. "She has been here every year," Poirot said, "for 12 years. The silence that followed had a texture to it, the silence of a great many things happening inside a person that have not yet decided whether they will become words or remain otherwise. Then Lucia stood up, brushed orange peel from her skirt with a practical, collected gesture, and said, "You want to know about the men." "I want," Poirot said carefully, "to understand what happened on the 3:12 from Liège. I want to know it completely and correctly, and from someone who was present, if such a person exists." He held her gaze. "And if such a person is willing." She looked at him for a long moment with those old, measuring eyes. "Not here," she said. She led him not back down to the harbour, but further into the upper town, and through alleys so narrow that the buildings overhead nearly met, past a church that smelled of candle wax and cool stone, and finally into a small courtyard where a lemon tree grew in a cracked urn, and a cat slept on a warm wall with absolute moral conviction. She sat on the low step of a disused doorway. Poirot found a suitable piece of wall and established himself against it. "I did not vanish," Lucia said. She said it with a precision that suggested she had rehearsed it, or something like it, many times, had turned the words over in private until they had the right shape. "I was taken. There is a difference. I want that to be understood first." "It is understood," Poirot said. "It was always my understanding." She looked at him with a brief, startled attention, as though this were not the response she had anticipated. Then she continued. "There had been a man in her carriage. She did not know him. She was 9 and travelling alone, and which she had done before on short journeys, and she was not frightened because there was nothing yet to be frightened of. The man had been pleasant. He had given her biscuits from a paper bag. Later she had been very drowsy, and then she had not been on the train at all. She did not remember the interval between those two facts. What followed was a different country, a different name, a family that was not her family, and knew it, and did not particularly care. Years of that. That the precise details she did not offer, and Poirot did not ask for them. He had heard enough of such accounts in his career to know that the details were less important than the fact of survival, and that the fact of survival in such circumstances said a great deal about the person who had accomplished it. "The men here," Poirot said when she had been silent a moment. "Bellini, Vasson, Kessler, Marceau. You know who they are." "I have been watching them," she said, "for some weeks, since I understood that they would come." She looked at her hands. "Someone told me where to find them." "Someone," Poirot repeated. He said it neutrally, without inflection, which was often the most effective way of asking a question. "I will not say who." She said it without defiance, simply and finally in the manner of a person who has thought carefully about what they will and will not reveal, and has drawn the line at a considered place. Poirot accepted this. He filed it. "These men," he said instead. "What was their role?" she told him. She had heard enough over the intervening years, through channels she declined to specify, to have assembled the framework. The man with the pleasant manner and the biscuits had been employed for the purpose. The others had facilitated: a railway clerk who looked away at the right moment, a watchmaker's apprentice who had access to the timetables, and to the quiet back office where arrangements could be made, or a young naval officer who handled the subsequent transportation, and a physician who signed what needed to be signed and asked nothing further. Kessler had organized it. The others had been paid. Elena Marceau, Poirot noted, had been the railway clerk. "She is dead," Lucia said. She said it with a flatness that was not indifference, but something more complicated, the emotional arithmetic of someone totaling a sum they have not decided yet how to feel about. "She is," Poirot agreed. And you, child, did you know this would happen?" The cat on the wall opened one eye, considered the morning, and closed it again. "I knew someone was angry," Lucia said. "I knew they had been angry for a long time. I did not know—" She stopped, reconsidered. "I did not know it would begin so quickly." Poirot looked at her steadily. The word "begin" sat in the courtyard between them with considerable weight. "Lucia," he said. It was the first time he had used her name, and she registered it with a small, involuntary stillness. "The person who gave you the list of names, the person who told you to give it to me. This person knew Elena would die. The note to Vasson promises 2 more deaths. If you know who is doing this, you must tell me, not for my sake." He let a pause settle. "For the sake of whoever is next." The lemon tree moved in a small, warm wind, and Lucia looked at him with the expression of someone standing at a door they have not decided whether to open. "I know what he is doing," she said at last. "I do not know how to stop him." She met his eyes. "That is why he wanted you here." The implication of this arrived in Poirot's mind with the cold precision of a key turning in a lock. He thought of Vasson's careful warning on the harbour wall, Kessler's measured availability, Bellini's retreat into shadow. 3 men whose guilt was established in Poirot's mind, if nowhere yet that mattered, and who were now being hunted by someone whose anger had been accumulating for 20 years. He understood suddenly and completely why his name had been circled rather than crossed out. He was not a target. He was a witness, summoned with considerable ingenuity to observe what was coming. And what was coming, he thought, rising from his wall with the deliberate care of a man who intends to prevent it. It was justice of the kind that does not wait for courts. He walked back through the alleys at a pace that drew glances, his cane striking the cobblestones, his mind running faster than his feet. He had been asking the wrong question. Not who had done this. He knew who had done this, and so, in their various ways, did all the relevant parties. The question was, who was doing it now? And whether Hercule Poirot, who believed in the law and in the ordering of things, and in the little grey cells above all instruments of justice, could arrive in time to insert himself between vengeance and its object. Vasson, he thought. It would be Vasson next. He was almost certain. He was also, he recognized with the particular discomfort of a man who is very seldom wrong, not entirely certain enough. Chapter 6. The Wrong Door. He was right about Vasson. He was wrong about the timing. Poirot reached the hotel at 10:15 to find the manager in the entrance hall with the expression of a man whose establishment has exceeded its permitted quota of catastrophe, and a fisherman named Aldo, who had pulled Captain Henri Vasson from the harbour 40 minutes earlier, unconscious and bleeding from a wound to the left side of his head, in the manner of a man who had encountered the harbour wall at considerable velocity, or who had been introduced to it. Vasson was alive. This was the first and most important fact, and Poirot established it before attending to any other. He was unconscious, carried to his room by Aldo and the manager's son, and Dr. Kessler had already been summoned and was, at this moment, attending him. Which was a circumstance that Poirot found simultaneously convenient and deeply unsatisfying, in the way of arrangements that are too neat by precisely 1 degree. He went upstairs. Kessler was closing his bag when Poirot entered, and the head wound had been dressed with professional efficiency. Vasson lay with his eyes closed and the stillness of serious concussion, his breathing audible and slow. On the floor beside the narrow bedside table in 3 pieces lay his wristwatch. The crystal was shattered. The hands had stopped. At 3:12. "He fell," Kessler said without looking up. "From where?" "The harbour wall, presumably. He was found in the water below it." Kessler straightened. "Well, the stones there are slippery after rain. It was an accident." "The watch," Poirot said. Kessler glanced at the floor with the expression of a man seeing something for the first time, which was not the expression of a man seeing something for the first time. "Watches break when one falls," he said. "They do," Poirot agreed. "They do not, however, invariably stop at the same hour as a dead woman's watch, and a stopped clock in a clockmaker's window, and a painted disc left beside a corpse. That requires a more specific kind of accident." Kessler met his eyes. The pale grey gaze was steady and entirely unreadable, and had been, Poirot reflected, from the first morning on the terrace. There was something almost admirable about it. The discipline of a man who has decided what he will and will not reveal, and has maintained that decision under considerable pressure. "Will he live?" Poirot asked. "Almost certainly. He will have a significant headache and a longer period of confusion. He may not remember the incident." A pause. "He may not remember a great deal." The phrasing was precise in the way that certain kinds of phrasing are precise. The way of a man who chooses his words for what they do not say, as much as for what they do. Poirot looked at him for a long moment. Then he went back downstairs and out into the street. He walked to the harbour wall and stood where Vasson had presumably stood, or been stood, and looked down at the water. The drop was not negligible. The stones below the surface were clearly visible in the morning clarity of the sea. Dark, irregular, the kind that do damage. A man pushed with sufficient conviction would go in head first and be fortunate to come out at all. Someone had pushed with sufficient conviction. That much Poirot did not doubt. What the question he turned his attention to, with the faint prickling at the base of his skull that always indicated a thought of genuine importance arriving from an unexpected direction, was not who had pushed Vasson. The answer to that was forming with increasing solidity in his mind, though not yet with the absolute certainty he required before he would trust it entirely. The question was what Vasson had known. He had known him, the unnamed, careful him on the harbour wall the previous day. He had known who was doing this. He had chosen not to say, which at the time Poirot had attributed to the wall behind Vasson's eyes, the long-maintained structure of self-protection. But now, with Vasson insensible in his room and his watch on the floor in 3 pieces, Poirot considered another possibility. Vasson had not said because he was afraid, not of Poirot, of being overheard. He walked back through the town to the old harbour quarter, moving with purpose now, and then descended a flight of worn steps he had noticed on his first afternoon without attending to them properly. A narrow access cut into the cliff face, leading to a lower level of the harbour where fishing equipment was stored in a series of vaulted chambers carved from the rock. He had been told by the old fisherman that morning that the passages connected beneath the town. Old smugglers' routes, the man had said, with the comfortable pride of a community at peace with its criminal history. And the entrance was a low arch half hidden by a rusted iron gate, standing open. Poirot considered it. He was not a man who found confined underground spaces congenial. The darkness, the uneven floor, the certainty of dust. None of these were recommendations. He went in nonetheless, because the little grey cells had noticed something and would not be quiet about it. What they had noticed was a disturbance in the dust at the threshold. Recent footprints, more than one set, going inward. He moved carefully, his eyes adjusting to the dimness. The passages were lower than he would have liked and smelled of the sea and of a long, damp history. Small chambers opened off the main tunnel at intervals. Storage once for things that did not benefit from documentation. He moved through 3 of them, pausing at each to examine what the darkness offered. In the 4th chamber he found the shoes. A child's shoes. Small, leather-soled, of a style that had not been fashionable for a decade or more. Placed in the centre of the chamber floor with a neatness that announced itself as deliberate, not abandoned, not lost, but positioned, set down by someone who wished them found. Poirot crouched beside them and looked without touching. They were not old. The leather was dry but not cracked. No dust in the interior. Whatever they were intended to suggest, and they were intended to suggest something specific, he had no doubt of that. They were props, not evidence. Theatre like everything else in this affair. Too new, he thought. Placed here for him. The footsteps behind him arrived at the entrance to the chamber with no particular attempt at silence, which was itself the most alarming thing about them, because a person who does not attempt silence in a confined space either does not know they are being followed or does not care. Poirot rose and turned in one movement, and the light from the tunnel entrance was sufficient to show him that the chamber was empty. The footsteps had stopped. He stood for 10 seconds, perhaps 15, listening to the particular quality of silence that follows the cessation of sound. The held breath silence of something waiting just beyond sight. Then a stone shifted somewhere behind him, and the light in the tunnel passage flickered, as though someone or something had passed between him and the entrance. And Poirot felt, with considerable vividness, that he had made an error of judgment in coming down here alone. He moved back through the passage at a pace he would not have described as hurried, and did not slow until he had emerged into the open air and the harmless brightness of the Via Pescatori, where an old woman was hanging washing from a line strung between two windows, and a cat was investigating a fish crate with professional thoroughness. He stood for a moment on the steps. Then he said, very quietly, to the morning, "Mon Dieu." Not because of the footsteps, not because of the shoes, because he had realized, standing in the dark with someone's proximity loud in his ears, that he had been led there. Not compelled, led, as one leads something by a sequence of arrangements designed to look like logic. The fisherman's mention of the tunnels, the open gate, the footprints placed at the threshold not by someone who had come before him, but by someone who had known he would come and had prepared the path accordingly. He was not hunting the killer. The killer, or the avenger, and the distinction was beginning to feel less absolute than it once had, was hunting him, moving him rather, like a piece on a board, positioned with care toward a square not yet visible. Poirot looked back at the harbour. Vasson had survived, which meant the second clock had not yet fully stopped, which meant there was still time. He set off toward the hotel at the brisker end of his walking pace, composing in his mind the conversation he intended to have with Dr. Adrian Kessler. Not the conversation Kessler was expecting, because that conversation, Poirot had decided, would be of no use to either of them. A different conversation entirely, the kind in which the question appears to be about one thing, and is, in fact, about another. He had always found those the most productive. Chapter 7. The Trap. Within the trap. Kessler received him in the hotel sitting room with the air of a man who has been expecting company and has arranged himself accordingly. Jacket buttoned, a small cup of coffee at his elbow, a medical journal open on the table before him at a page he had not been reading. Poirot sat down, declined coffee, and said, "Tell me about the railway stations." Kessler looked at him. "I beg your pardon?" "The stations," Poirot said pleasantly. "You have spent a great deal of your career near them, I think. Brussels Central, where you practiced for some years after qualifying. Liège-Guillemins, where you had a consulting arrangement with the railway company's medical service in the early years of your career. It is useful work, medical provision at large transport hubs. One meets an extraordinary variety of people." He paused, "and one understands the timetables very well." The journal on the table did not move. Kessler's hands did not move. These were the signs, Poirot had found, of a particular kind of self-control. Not the absence of reaction, but the vigorous suppression of it, which required effort and therefore revealed itself in an excessive stillness. I had a consulting arrangement, Kessler said at last. As you say, it was a long time ago. 20 years, Poirot agreed. The 312 from Liège. I have been thinking about that journey with considerable care, and what I have arrived at is this. He settled back in his chair with the ease of a man about to deliver a lecture he has prepared thoroughly. There were 5 people involved in what happened to that child. One arranged the transportation afterward. The naval connection was useful for that. One looked the other way at the administrative level. One provided forged documentation. One waited on the platform at the receiving end of the journey and ensured the child was, as one might say, delivered. And one organized the whole enterprise, recruited the others, and ensured that each person knew only their own part and not the others. Kessler said nothing. It was cleverly done, Poirot continued. The segmentation meant that any single participant could be sacrificed without compromising the whole. It also meant that no participant could betray another with any completeness. They each held a fragment, not the map. He looked at Kessler with an expression of mild, academic interest. The map was held only by the organizer. The coffee cup at Kessler's elbow had begun to cool. He had not touched it. I am telling you nothing you do not know, Poirot said. I offer it not as revelation, but as demonstration. Demonstration that I know the shape of this thing, and the particular shape. He leaned forward slightly. What I have been asking myself since yesterday evening is why Elena Marceau is dead while you are not. Kessler's chin lifted a fraction. She was the most visible of the 5, Poirot continued. A railway clerk. Her role was the most exposed, the most easily connected to the event itself. And yet, she was killed first, which suggests the killer began with those most likely to speak, not those most culpable. He paused, which tells me something about what the killer fears. Not justice exactly. Exposure of a specific truth, one particular fact that has not yet come to light. You are theorizing, Kessler said. His voice was steady. It was the steadiness of an engine held under great compression. I am, Poirot said agreeably. Let me theorize further. The child was not simply taken, she was sold. And the money, I have been troubling myself about the money. Where did it go? Not to Vasson, who has lived modestly. Not to Bellini, whose shop is respectable but unremarkable. Not to Eleanor, who died in a hotel room of the kind that suggests careful economies. He tilted his head. The money went to the organizer. That is the particular truth the killer wants confirmed before the appropriate parties. It is the difference between those who were paid a small, specific sum for a specific, terrible service, and the one who profited substantially and at length. Kessler rose from his chair with a deliberateness that was more alarming than haste would have been. I think, he said, that this conversation has reached its natural conclusion. On the contrary, Poirot said without moving, it has reached the point at which it becomes interesting. He produced the enamelled disc from his pocket and set it on the table between them. Time remembers. Whoever engraved that understood that the specific truth matters enormously to a specific person. Not a prosecutor, not a court. A person. He looked up. The mother. The name settled in the room like a weight dropped from a height. Kessler looked at the disc for a long moment. Then he looked at Poirot with an expression that had finally, after days of careful management, relinquished its professional composure and revealed something else beneath it. Something complicated, not without intelligence, not entirely without shame. "She cannot prove anything," he said. It was not a boast. It was the assessment of a man examining his own position with honest eyes. "Perhaps not," Poirot said, "but that is not, I think, her primary concern." He rose, pocketed the disc, and straightened his cuffs with his customary precision. "Tell me, this morning, when you attended Vasson, was there anything in his room that gave you cause for concern? Any object note or arrangement that struck you as deliberate?" Kessler's eyes sharpened. "No. Nothing on the floor, the nightstand, the windowsill. Nothing." He said it with the certainty of a man who looked carefully and is confident of what he found. "Why?" Poirot did not answer this. He moved to the door, then stopped, as though a thought had arrived as an afterthought rather than by design, a technique he had employed for 40 years with consistent success. "The photograph," he said. "The one found in Elena's luggage. 5 people beside a railway clock. One face scratched out." He turned. Whose face was it? The silence was different this time. Not calculated, not compressed. The silence of a man who has just understood the precise dimensions of a trap and is measuring them against his available options. "I don't know what photograph you mean," Kessler said. Poirot smiled, the small, private smile of a man who has received the answer he needed, or wrapped in a denial he expected. He went upstairs. He stood in the corridor outside Elena's room, which the manager had locked and not yet had the resolve to address further, and he thought about photographs. The one from Elena's luggage showed 5 people. One scratched out. But scratching a face from a photograph is an act that requires the possession of the photograph, and Elena had possessed it, which meant either she had scratched the face herself, protecting someone, or it had been scratched by the same hand that arranged her and replaced in her luggage as another piece of the theatre. He unlocked the room with the spare key the manager had, after some persuasion entrusted to him. He searched it, methodically, without haste, beginning with the obvious places and moving to the less obvious, in order of decreasing probability. He had done this in a great many rooms over a great many years, and had developed the particular patience it required. The willingness to look at things that are not there as carefully as at things that are. The photograph was in the lining of Elena's smallest travelling case, accessed through a seam that had been opened and re-stitched with a thread of marginally different weight. He extracted it with the care its fragility and significance demanded. 5 people on a railway platform. A clock on the wall behind them. 3:12. Elena Marceau, younger, recognizable. Vasson, trimmer with the posture of early career. Bellini, heavier then, with the look of a younger man inhabiting an older man's caution. A 4th figure, smaller, turned slightly away. The 5th face had been scratched out with the point of something sharp, scratched through the paper, almost. The act of someone in considerable feeling. Poirot looked at the 4th figure, the one turned partly away, whose face was visible in 3/4 profile. He looked at it for a long time. Then he sat down on the edge of Elena's stripped bed and thought carefully about everything he had assumed and everything he had not yet examined, and the relationship between those 2 categories, and what happened when a piece moved from the first to the second. He had thought the killings were misdirection from a primary target. He had thought the primary target was Mrs. Langley. He had thought the killer was hunting the witnesses to clear the last remaining proof. Now, holding the photograph, he thought instead, the victims are not the story. The child is the story. And Mrs. Langley, the mother, the last witness, the woman who came to the same town every year for 12 years, who watched the road with careful eyes, who said before that was a different life altogether. Mrs. Langley was not the intended final victim. She was the intended final audience. He was on his feet before the thought had fully completed itself, moving to the door with a velocity that was uncharacteristic and entirely necessary, because the other thought that arrived on the heels of the first was this: the killer did not need to eliminate Mrs. Langley. The killer needed her alive, present, and watching, which meant the killer was not finished arranging things, which meant the killer was, at this moment, somewhere in the hotel. The corridor was empty. The corridor was quiet. At the far end, the door to Mrs. Langley's room stood open by precisely 3 inches. The particular 3 inches of a door not properly closed, pushed ajar by someone who did not wish to make the sound of a latch. Poirot moved toward it without making a sound himself. The little grey cells, which had been working at considerable pressure for 4 days, delivered their conclusion with the cold clarity of a correct answer written in ink. He had been solving the wrong problem. He had been so occupied with who was killing the conspirators that he had not, until this moment, stood back far enough to see that the killings, and the theatre, and the stopped clocks, and even his own presence here were all components of a single, larger design. Not a revenge, a revelation, and the person at the centre of it, the architect of the whole elaborate machinery, was already inside the hotel. Poirot put his hand on the door to Mrs. Langley's room and pushed it open. Chapter 8. Counter-Gambit. The room was empty, not merely unoccupied, empty in the particular way of a space recently vacated, the air still carrying the faint warmth of presence. The window stood open. The curtain moved. On the small writing desk, a sheet of hotel notepaper had been placed, with the same deliberate neatness that characterized everything in this affair. And on it, in Mrs. Langley's careful hand, 3 words: "I am safe." Poirot stood with it in his hands for a moment. Then he set it down, crossed to the window, and looked out. The hotel's rear aspect gave on to a narrow service lane that ran between the building and the garden wall, wide enough for one person moving quickly. Beyond the wall, the upper town climbed its terraces in the afternoon light. He went to find Lucia. She was not at the harbour, not in the upper square, not in the courtyard with the lemon tree. He tried the church, on the instinct that it was the kind of place a person of watchful habits might choose to sit undisturbed, and found her in the 3rd pew from the back, her bare feet on the cool stone floor, her hands in her lap, looking at the altar with the concentrated attention of someone conducting an internal argument with something larger than themselves. She heard him come in. She did not turn. "She went to you," Poirot said. He sat in the pew beside her. Lucia was quiet for a moment. "This morning, before you came to the harbour, you sent her away. I told her to go somewhere she would not be found until evening." She looked at her hands. "I did not want her in the hotel. Not today." "Because today," Poirot said carefully, "you expected something to happen." It was not an accusation. It had the quality, rather, of a man setting down a piece that has been in his pocket for some time and examining it in better light. Lucia did not deny it. She sat with the stillness of someone who has decided to stop spending energy on evasion and has found it, unexpectedly, a relief. "There is a man," she said. "He has been in Porto Bellagio for 3 weeks. Longer than Vasson, longer than Bellini. He arrived before any of them, and he arranged for them to come. He arranged for you to come." She paused. "He arranged for me to come." Poirot sat very still. "And you? You knew this when you came?" "I knew someone had found me." She said it without drama, with the flatness of a fact that has been lived with for long enough to lose its power to shock. I had been careful for years. I had been various people in various places. But someone had found me regardless and had sent a letter. And the letter said that if I came here to this town, in this month, I would learn what happened to me and why. I would have names. I would have proof. She looked up at the altar again. It said I would have what I was owed. "And the person who sent this letter," Poirot said, "you did not know who it was." "I suspected." She turned her head and looked at him directly for the first time since he had sat down, with the serious, measuring eyes that had been old from the moment he first saw them. "I suspected, and I came anyway." Well, that tells you something about what 20 years without an answer does to a person. Poirot said nothing for a moment. The church held them both in its cool, indifferent silence. A silence that had absorbed a great many human difficulties over the centuries and was not unduly troubled by theirs. "The man who has been arranging this," he said at last. "I think I know who he is, but I would like you to say it." She looked at him steadily. "His name is Renard," she said. "He was a detective, Belgian. He investigated my disappearance." She paused. "He was the one who told my mother the case was closed, that I had, in all probability, not survived." Poirot absorbed this with the outward calm of a man receiving information he was expecting, and the inward sensation of a man who has just seen the entire architecture of a construction shift to reveal its true, load-bearing walls. Renard. He had known the name 20 years ago. A peripheral figure. You are a municipal detective in Liège whose jurisdiction intersected briefly with the case before it was handed upward. A man who had told a mother her child was dead and had been wrong, or had known he was wrong, and had chosen the convenience of a closed file over the effort of a continued search. A man who had, apparently, spent 20 years arriving at a position on that choice. "He told her I was dead," Lucia said. "And then he spent the rest of his career finding out what had actually happened to me." She said this without particular emotion, which was its own kind of emotion. "He found me 8 months ago. He did not tell me who he was. He wrote to me only as someone who knew the truth, and asked if I wanted it." Her chin lifted slightly. I said yes. "And the deaths?" Poirot said. "Elena Marceau, the attack on Vasson." Lucia was quiet for a moment that was somewhat too long. "He told me," she said carefully, "that the conspirators would be confronted with what they had done, that they would be made to answer for it before my mother, before me." She looked at her hands again. "He did not tell me how." "Did you ask?" Another silence, shorter this time and more honest. "I did not ask precisely enough," she said. I think I did not want to know precisely enough." She looked at him with an expression that was prepared to receive judgment and had arranged itself to bear it. "That also tells you something." "It tells me," Poirot said gently, "that you are a person who has been wronged enormously and is human. These are not incompatible with also being a person of conscience." He rose from the pew. "Where is Renard now?" She gave him a street and a building, a rented room in the upper town, and above a carpenter's workshop, taken under a different name 6 weeks earlier. Poirot committed it to memory with the efficiency of long practice. "I will need Mrs. Langley tonight," he said. "Visible in the hotel dining room in the normal way. Can you bring her there by 8 o'clock? Lucia looked at him carefully. "What are you going to do?" "I am going to do what I should perhaps have done several days ago, which is to stop allowing other people to arrange the pieces and arrange some myself." He settled his hat. "I am going to make Renard believe that I have left." She blinked. "And have you?" "I will have been seen to depart in the late afternoon, which is a different matter entirely." He looked at her with an expression that was kind and somewhat serious, and contained within it, just visible, the particular satisfaction of a man who has found the correct sequence. "Lucia, what Renard has done in staging this, do you understand that it cannot be permitted to conclude in the way he intends?" She held his gaze. "You mean Kessler?" "I mean Kessler. Vassans survived, and the wound to his head will heal, and I intend to ensure that he lives to make a full accounting to the proper authorities. But Kessler is the primary object. Kessler organized. Kessler profited. And Renard has been patient for 20 years, and his patience is nearly spent. I believe he intends tonight to finish what he began, and I believe he intends for your mother to be present when he does." The light through the high church window had shifted to the amber of late afternoon. Lucia sat with it falling across her hands in her lap, and for a moment she looked not like the watchful, self-sufficient creature of the harbour steps and the upper town alleys, but simply like what she also was, a child to whom something irreversible had happened, sitting in a church, working out what she believed about justice and what she was prepared to accept in its name. "She does not know," Lucia said. "My mother, she does not know about tonight." "No," Poirot agreed. "Which is partly why she must be in that dining room, and why you must be with her, and why neither of you must on any account go upstairs before I send word." He moved toward the church door. "I will explain everything afterward. That is a promise, and I make very few of those because I intend to keep the ones I make." He stepped out into the late afternoon, into the warm light and the smell of the sea, and the sound of the town going about its early evening business with the comfortable unawareness of a place that does not know how close certain things have come. He had one visit to make, to a rented room above a carpenter's workshop, before he set the next piece in motion. He made his way there with the unhurried step of a man engaged in a pleasant evening walk, which was the careful opposite of what he was doing, and which satisfied him greatly. Then, at 5:30, Hercule Poirot was observed by 3 separate persons: the hotel manager, the waiter Stefano, and the old fisherman at the harbour, departing Porto Bellagio on foot toward the northern road, just with his travelling bag and his cane and the general air of a man who has concluded his business and is leaving. He was not leaving. He was in the hotel, in the supply cupboard 2 doors from Kessler's room, in the dark, in considerable discomfort, waiting. He had wedged the door open by the width of a finger. He was there for an hour and 40 minutes, which was 40 minutes longer than he had estimated, and which he spent in a state of intense and unpleasant alertness, his eyes fixed on the strip of lamplight at the corridor's end, his mind running through the sequence of events with the methodical clarity of a man who has eliminated his alternatives and made his peace with what remains. At 20 minutes past 7, a door opened at the corridor's far end. Footsteps, measured, unhurried. The footsteps of a man who believes himself unobserved, moving with the quiet confidence of someone who has been in this corridor before, in his imagination at least, but many times. They stopped outside Kessler's door. Poirot watched through the finger's width of open door, and the shadow that fell across the corridor floorboards was that of a man of compact and patient build, carrying something in his right hand that caught the light from the corridor lamp in a way that removed all remaining uncertainty about his intentions. Poirot placed his hand on the cupboard door, and, from within Kessler's room, Kessler's voice came, low, controlled, with the faintest fraying at its edge of something that 4 days of careful management had not previously permitted to surface. "I have been expecting you," Kessler said through the door. "Come in." The shadow in the corridor did not move. Then, from behind Poirot's cupboard, from the direction he had specifically not been watching, a voice spoke with a calm so complete it was its own kind of statement. "And I," said the voice, "have been expecting you both." Poirot turned, and the corridor behind him was occupied by a man of a middle age with a compact, settled bearing, and the patient, unhurried face of a person who has arranged a great many things and is now simply waiting for them to arrive in the correct order. He was smiling. "You are exactly where I wanted you, Monsieur Poirot," Renard said. Chapter 9. Checkmate. The smile, Poirot noted, was not the smile of a man enjoying himself. It was the smile of a man who has carried something very heavy for a very long time, and has arrived at last at the place where he intended to set it down. There was relief in it, and exhaustion, and beneath both of those, something that Poirot recognized with the particular clarity of a man who has spent his career reading faces. The expression of someone who is no longer entirely certain that what they have done and what they are about to do are the same thing they set out to accomplish 20 years ago. Renard was perhaps 60. His hair was white at the temples and the rest of it. He wore a dark coat of good quality and carried in his right hand not a weapon as Poirot had briefly feared, but a leather folder of the kind associated with documents rather than violence. His left hand, Poirot observed, was empty and slightly open. The unconscious posture of a man prepared to demonstrate that he means no immediate harm. Poirot stepped out of the cupboard. He did it with as much dignity as a man can muster after an hour and 40 minutes in a linen cupboard, which is not, he reflected, an unlimited quantity. "Renard," he said. "Monsieur Poirot." The older man inclined his head. "I watched you leave. I also watched you return through the kitchen entrance 17 minutes later. The bag you carried out was somewhat lighter than the one you arrived with, or which suggested it contained primarily an overcoat and your smaller toilet case. The cane, however, you brought back." His eyes moved to it briefly. "A man does not abandon his cane." You are observant, Poirot said. I was a detective for 31 years. Renard said it without pride. Observation becomes a difficulty one cannot switch off, like a tap with a faulty washer. He glanced at Kessler's door. He is in there. He has been in there since this afternoon, waiting for me. He received a note this morning suggesting I wish to speak with him privately, without interference. A pause. The note was from me. And the revolver he is almost certainly holding, Poirot said, is because he intends the conversation to be brief. Yes. Renard's expression did not change. He has always been practical. It is what made him effective 20 years ago, and what has kept him undisturbed since. When a difficulty presents itself, Doctor, our Kessler removes it. He looked at Poirot steadily. You were to have been a difficulty after tonight. Poirot filed this without visible reaction. You brought me here to witness, and then you intended to remove the witness. I intended, Renard said with the careful precision of a man making a distinction that matters to him, to ensure that the truth was established completely before I concluded anything. I am not. He stopped, began again. I did not begin this as a murderer, Monsieur Poirot. I began it as a man who closed a file he should not have closed and spent 20 years unable to close his eyes with any comfort. His voice had remained level throughout, but it was the level of a depth, not a shallows. Eleanor Marceau died of poison in a locked room. That is true. I placed the clock, I placed the disc. The theatre was mine. But the poison was in the wine she poured herself at 11 o'clock that evening, from a bottle left outside her door, left by Kessler, who had realized when he saw me in the town that his original silence was about to become insufficient. The corridor was very still. Kessler killed Elena Marceau, Poirot said. She had telephoned him from the post office 3 days before you arrived. She was frightened. She told him a Belgian detective had been making inquiries, that she intended to speak. Renard's mouth tightened. She was going to tell you everything. He could not permit that. And Vasson. Vasson I pushed. I will not conceal it. He said it plainly, without embellishment, the admission of a man who has decided that the truth in its entirety is the only remaining option. I did not intend to kill him. I intended to frighten him, to damage him sufficiently that he would speak before any court that asked him questions. He will recover. A flicker of something crossed his face. I have checked twice since this morning. Poirot looked at him for a long moment, at the white-haired, exhausted, entirely self-possessed man standing in the corridor with his leather folder and his open left hand, who had built an elaborate machinery of revelation and retribution and was now, at its culmination, offering the truth instead of completing it. The folder, Poirot said. Renard held it out. Inside, 20 years of careful work, bank records, letters, a sworn statement from a woman in Antwerp who had received Lucia from Vasson and placed her with a family across the border, and who had, and under Renard's patient pressure, written down everything she knew and signed her name to it. Shipping manifests. A photograph of Kessler meeting a man outside a Brussels bank in the winter following the disappearance. The account, Renard explained, into which the proceeds had been divided, though the division had been, characteristically, unequal. Kessler's portion had been 4 times that of the others. This is enough, Poirot said. He did not mean for the folder. He meant for everything. Or I know, Renard said. And then, unexpectedly, I am sorry for the theatrics, for the clocks. He glanced at the stopped face of his own watch, which he had arranged, Poirot now understood, not as a symbol for others, but as a reminder for himself. The hour he had decided to stop carrying the case as a private matter. I wanted her to understand, the mother and the child. I wanted them to see it assembled, not told to them, but shown. Every piece, every name. His voice, for the first time, she lost a fraction of its steadiness. I owed them that much. At the very minimum, that much. Poirot said, "You owed them the truth delivered through proper channels at the time it became available, which was not 20 years ago, but was also not this week." He said it without harshness. However, this is a conversation for another occasion. At present. He stepped forward, raised his cane, and knocked upon Kessler's door with 3 deliberate raps. "Kessler," he said, "it is Poirot, and I am coming in, and I am not alone, and the revolver will be of no use to you whatsoever, because Renard has been good enough to provide me with documentation that renders your position entirely and permanently indefensible. I suggest you put it in your pocket before you embarrass yourself." A silence of considerable length followed this. Then the sound of a drawer closing. Poirot opened the door. Kessler stood at the window with his back to the room, looking out at the harbour lights reflected in the dark water, his hands clasped behind him with the rigid composure of a man holding himself together by an act of pure will. He did not turn when they entered. He did not speak for a long time. When he did, his voice had lost the measured, professional quality it had maintained across 4 days of interrogation and evasion. What remained was something older and more tired. "How much does she know?" he said. "The child." "Enough," Poirot said. Rather more than enough." Kessler's shoulders dropped a fraction, the movement of a structure relieved of a load it has been bearing for longer than was sustainable. "I want you to understand," he said, still to the window, "that I have thought about it. Every day for 20 years. I want that on record." "Thinking about a thing," Poirot said, "is not the same as doing anything about it. That distinction will no doubt be explored at considerable length by others." He crossed the room and stood beside Kessler at the window, and for a moment both men looked out at the water. "You will come downstairs now. There are people in the dining room who are owed certain explanations, and I will not have them waiting any longer." Kessler turned from the window. His face, in the lamplight, was the face of a man at the end of a very long evasion. Not broken exactly, but spent. The intelligence was still there, the composure reconstructing itself by habit, but it had nothing beneath it now. The foundations were gone. "You are magnificent, Monsieur Poirot," he said. It had the quality of a genuine assessment. "Yes," said Poirot simply. "I am. Come." The dining room was quiet when the 3 men entered it. Mrs. Langley sat at the corner table with a cup of tea she had not drunk. At her posture, the careful uprightness of a woman who has been waiting for something for a very long time, and does not entirely trust herself when it arrives. Beside her, Lucia sat straight-backed in her chair, her bare feet. The management had long abandoned any attempt at the house rules, flat on the floor, her dark eyes moving to Kessler as he entered with an attention that was not hatred and not forgiveness, and not any single thing that has a simple name. Poirot drew up a chair and sat, and placed the enamelled disc on the table between them all. Then he began to speak. He spoke for some time. He was thorough because thoroughness was owed, and he was precise because precision was the only kindness available in such a moment. And he watched the two women across the table, the mother and the daughter, who were strangers and not strangers, sitting an arm's length apart with 20 years of silence between them like a held breath. And he did not soften what needed to be heard, because the truth does not benefit from softening, and they had both, in their separate ways, earned the unmodified version of it. When he finished, the dining room was very quiet. Mrs. Langley looked at Lucia. Lucia looked at Mrs. Langley. Neither of them spoke. Then Mrs. Langley reached across the table and placed her hand, very carefully, over Lucia's. Lucia looked down at it. She did not move away. Poirot rose quietly and went to stand at the window, giving them the room's attention without his own, and he looked out at the harbour where the lights of Porto Bellagio lay, reflected in the dark water, trembling and duplicated. And he listened to the silence behind him with the particular quality of attention he reserved for silences that are not empty. Kessler, beside him at the window, said nothing. He was, for perhaps the first time in 20 years, entirely out of things to say. Chapter 10. The World. After the Carabinieri arrived the following morning, the road north had been cleared overnight, the rockfall attended to with the unhurried efficiency of men who have cleared rockfalls before and expect to clear them again. And 2 officers came down into Porto Bellagio in a motor car that raised a small cloud of white dust as it descended the hill, and as though announcing itself to the town before the town had quite decided how to receive it. Poirot had sent the telegram at first light. He had walked to the post office himself in the early morning quiet before the cafes opened, and before the fishermen had finished with the boats, and had composed the message with care and sent it, and then had stood for a moment outside the post office in the cool air looking at the Via Orologio and the clockmaker's window, where the brass carriage clock still sat at the centre of its display. Its hands had not moved. He went in. Bellini was already at his workbench, though the hour was early, with the air of a man who has not slept particularly well and has decided that occupation is preferable to its absence. He looked up when Poirot entered, and something in his face settled. Not relief exactly, but the particular expression of a man who has been carrying a thing at arm's length for a very long time and sees, approaching, the moment when he will be permitted to put it down. Poirot did not sit. He stood before the workbench and looked at Bellini for a moment in silence. "The clock in the window," he said. "Will you repair it now?" Bellini looked at his hands. They were the hands of a craftsman, capable, careful, shaped by decades of fine work. He turned them over once, and then reached across the workbench and lifted the brass carriage clock with a gentleness that was not merely professional. "Yes," he said. He did not say anything else. Poirot did not require him to. The Carabinieri would attend to the rest, and the courts after that, and Bellini would answer for what he had done in the way that was appropriate. Not the way Renard had intended, which had been more absolute, but the way of institutions and processes, and the slow, imperfect machinery of the law that Poirot had spent his career trusting, precisely because it was imperfect, because the alternative was something that corroded the person who employed it, however justified the corrosion might appear. He left Bellini with the clock open in his hands and walked back to the hotel through the waking town. Kessler was taken away at 9:30. He came down the hotel stairs with the 2 carabinieri officers and the manager, and the particular quality of composure that belongs to a man who has made a decision about how he will conduct himself in the final chapter of a thing, and is adhering to it with precision. He wore his jacket. He carried nothing. At the hotel entrance he paused and turned, and his pale grey eyes found Poirot across the lobby with the directness of a man delivering a last assessment. "Oh, you had the photograph from the beginning," Kessler said. "The one from Elena's luggage." "From the second morning," Poirot agreed, "and the face that had been scratched out." "Renard's face," Poirot said. "Elena scratched it out when she understood who he was and what he was doing. She was protecting him, or attempting to. An interesting choice under the circumstances for a woman who had every reason to fear him." He paused. "She was, I think, not entirely without conscience. It arrived late, but it arrived." Kessler considered this with the judicial attention he brought to everything. "And mine," he said, "my conscience." "You told me it had been active for 20 years, Poirot said. "I believed you. I also believe that an active conscience and a reformed behaviour are 2 different things, and that the courts will be interested in both." Kessler nodded once, a small final acknowledgement, and went out into the morning. Renard was a more complicated matter, and he had remained in the hotel through the night, at Poirot's request, in the room he had taken under a false name 6 weeks earlier, and had spent the hours, as far as Poirot could determine, in the preparation of a written account of the full extent of his investigation. Every document, every source, every step of the 20-year process, by which a closed file had been prized open again and its contents laid on the table. The account was meticulous. It was also, in its way, a confession, and Renard had written it with the knowledge that it was both things simultaneously and had not flinched from either. He presented it to Poirot over coffee in the hotel sitting-room before the carabinieri arrived, and Poirot read the relevant portions with the concentration they deserved, and then sat with it in his lap and looked at the man across the table. "You will tell them about Vasson," Poirot said. It was not a question. "Everything," Renard said. "I pushed him. I intended harm. I will say so." He held Poirot's gaze with eyes that were tired in a way that went some distance below the merely physical. "I find I have very little appetite left for concealment." 20 years of it will have that effect," Poirot said. He set the account on the table between them. "You did something wrong in Liège when you closed that file. Then you spent 20 years doing something right in the investigation, and then you came here and did something wrong again." He picked up his coffee. "You are not a simple case, Renard." "No," Renard agreed. "I never was." The carabinieri, when they arrived, treated Renard with a respect that suggested his written documentation had preceded him usefully, and took him away in the same motorcar as Kessler, but, with a tact that Poirot appreciated, not in the same moment. Captain Vasson was removed to a hospital in the nearest city that afternoon, as still concussed but improving and, according to the attending physician, entirely capable of speech within a few days. He had asked, upon being told this news, whether Poirot was still in Porto Bellagio. When informed that he was, Vincent had said nothing further and had lain back on his pillow with the expression of a man who is not certain whether this information is a comfort or a complication. Poirot thought it was probably both. He spent the afternoon in the hotel garden, or with coffee and without company, in the particular stillness of a man at the conclusion of a considerable effort. The garden was pleasant in the afternoon light. A lizard occupied a warm stone nearby with complete conviction. The bougainvillea moved in a small salt wind off the harbour, and the town went about its ordinary business around him. The fish seller, the baker, the afternoon bells, with the magnificent indifference of a place that has accommodated drama before and intends to outlast this instance of it as well. He took out his pocket watch. He held it in his palm and listened to it tick with an attention he did not usually give it. The small, steady, indifferent industry of a mechanism doing precisely what it was made to do, moment by moment, without opinion on the nature of the moments or the quality of what occurred within them. Time remembers. He thought about that, about what it meant and what Renard had intended by it, and whether the intention matched the truth of the thing. Time did not remember, in his experience. Time moved, and what had happened within it either left a mark on the people who had been present, or it did not. The remembering was human, and the human capacity for it was the source of both its virtue and its damage, the thing that made accountability possible and revenge comprehensible in equal measure. He closed the watch. Mrs. Langley and Lucia were in the garden when he looked up, coming through the gate from the hotel with the careful, slightly formal bearing of two people navigating a situation for which no established etiquette exists. They had spoken, he knew, through the night and into the morning. What had passed between them was not his to know, and he did not enquire. He could see the shape of it in how they moved. Not yet at ease, not yet anything so simple, but oriented toward one another in the tentative, serious way of two people who have decided that the difficulty ahead is worth attempting. They sat at his invitation in the garden chairs near his own. Mrs. Langley ordered tea. Lucia consulted, asked for an orange with the directness of someone unaccustomed to being asked and finding it, cautiously, acceptable. For a time, no one said anything. The afternoon continued around them. "I owe you an apology," Mrs. Langley said eventually. She said it to Poirot with the quiet composure of a woman who does not make statements of this kind lightly and means this one fully. "I suspected from very early that you were investigating something connected to what happened. I was not candid with you." "You were afraid," Poirot said, "of what the answer might be. That is not a failing I find it easy to condemn." "She came every year," Lucia said. She was looking at the bougainvillea rather than at either of them. What's in the way of someone who can say a difficult thing more easily if they are not being directly observed while saying it? "Here, to the same town." She paused. "I did not know that until last night." "The harbour is very visible from the road," Mrs. Langley said. Her voice was steady, but only just. "I could see the boats. I could see the children on the quay." She stopped. The lizard on the warm stone adjusted its position by a fraction, and as if in editorial comment on the inadequacy of all human articulation. Poirot said, "There is a great deal of time ahead. That is not nothing." Neither of them answered this. They both, he thought, understood it in different and equally complicated ways. He did not elaborate. The afternoon moved toward evening, the harbour filled with returning boats. The cafe clock on the promenade, which the owner had wound that morning for the first time in several days, struck the hour in its thin or cheerful voice, and the sound of it drifted up through the salt air and into the garden, past the bougainvillea and over the warm wall, with the unconcerned amiability of a mechanism that has been repaired and intends to keep going. It did not stop at 3:12. It went past it. Poirot noted this with a satisfaction that was quiet and genuine and entirely his own. He replaced his pocket watch in its customary pocket, aligned it with the precision that the action always deserved, and looked out toward the harbour where the last light of the afternoon lay on the water in long, golden repetitions. And the fishing boats came in, and the children ran on the quay, and Porto Bellagio breathed in the evening air as though nothing very much had happened, as towns have always done and always will. The clock above the cafe kept its steady, ordinary, unremarkable time. The case of the stopped clock was closed. Hercule Poirot finished his coffee. It was, as always, precisely the correct temperature.